In this section, I want to talk about safety precautions. This is a question I get fairly often. I mean, welding looks really, ooh, sparks, heat, danger, electrocution, all that stuff. So there's a natural reluctance and caution about the process. But the great news is that it's very easy to deal with the safety hazards. And there are essentially 5 safety hazards, or at least the perception of 5. There's the shock hazard. Am I going to get shocked by this welder if I do something wrong? There is the burn hazard. And there's heat, of course. What am I going to do to prevent myself from getting burned? There's also the vision hazard. That's probably the most crucial, because the light given off by the arc from any kind of an arc welder, really any kind of welder, whether it's arc or torch welding, it's very, very bright. So what do you need to do to protect your vision? What do you need to do to protect your lungs? What is the fume hazard? How serious is that? What do I need to do to protect myself? And then there's something obvious, just the burning things down hazard, so catching fire. So we're going to look at each one of those individually, beginning with the shock hazard. So what's the chances, what are the chances that you're going to get a shock, either an uncomfortable shock or even a lethal shock from a welder like this? And the answer is the risk is extremely low, and that's because the voltage involved is also very low. Typical voltages, as measured from the tip of the welding wire to the workpiece that is connected to this ground clamp, probably runs around 15 or 20 volts. A welder like this shows you what the operating voltage is. That's just a little bit more than a car battery. And nobody ever worries about getting electrocuted from a car battery because the voltage isn't high enough to ram that electricity through a human body, essentially. There's too much internal resistance for that to happen. Another reason why the shock hazard is pretty much non-existent when you're doing electric welding is because you're well protected. You're going to be wearing, at a minimum, you're going to be wearing a pair of these leather gloves, and that offers some insulation value. You're going to be wearing footwear that insulates you well from the ground. So I have never even gotten a tingle from an electric welder in 40 years of using them. So it looks like it's a hazard. A big flashing spark, of course, yikes, that must be dangerous. But from an electrical point of view, it's not really dangerous. When you take the proper precautions, your safety is assured, and that's because the voltage is so low. Now, of course, there's heat involved. There's the burn hazard. What do you do to protect against that? Well, that's pretty obvious, really. And that's where protection and safety equipment comes in. You're going to want to use gloves at a minimum. These are welder's gloves. Now, what I find, I'm right-handed. I hold the welding gun with my right hand. I tend to support my hand, my right hand, with this left hand. And that's why I usually wear a glove only on my left hand. I could wear it on my right hand, but I hardly find it necessary because the right hand is fairly far back from the action. It's protected by the other hand, and not wearing a glove on your gun hand allows a little more control, a little more fine control. But if you want to wear 2 gloves, that's great. There are going to be some sparks coming off from the welding process, not a whole lot, and that's why you might want to wear a leather jacket. There are leather welding jackets that are quite flame-proof, quite fireproof, and they protect very well. Now, of course, and I'll get to this in a minute, you're going to want to wear a welder's face shield. You absolutely have to have one of these. There's no 2 ways about it. But even with a helmet like this on, it's possible for sparks to fly up and land on the back of your head. It happens once in a while, so that's why they've invented these welding caps. It's a non-flammable fabric. It keeps your hair protected. It keeps your scalp protected. And essentially that and some solid footwear where sparks cannot affect it, and you're protected against the burning hazard. It's really, as I said, it's really very simple. Now, the vision hazard, the vision issue, as I said, is where this welding mask comes in, welding helmet. Now, about 20 years ago or so, there was a revolution in technology for welding helmets. Until then, there was a lens that was very, very dark, and that's the lens you looked through. And the reason it was very, very dark is because it had to be that dark in order to protect your eyes once the spark has started. The problem is that until you start the arc, you can't see anything with a traditional helmet on. So you have to get good, and when you pull that helmet down, you have to get good at remembering where you need to start, and you start the arc, and then you can see and adjust yourself and get into the proper welding rhythm. People learned how to do this, how to essentially start an arc blind, and people got very good at it. But it is a hurdle that you don't necessarily need to have to cross, because today's generation of welding helmets are what they call auto darkening. So if you put this thing on, it looks like you got a pair of sunglasses on. It looks, from your point of view, like you are wearing a pair of sunglasses, and that it's darker, but you can see perfectly. Now, as soon as the arc starts up, and I'm talking 20, 30, 40 milliseconds maybe. You know, there's 1,000 milliseconds in a second, so 30 milliseconds is next to nothing. Within that period of time, the lens will automatically darken. So it actually darkens before the bright light has a chance to hurt your eyes. And once again, technology has really made it all very simple. You buy one, you put it on, it works. That's essentially it. And it also means that there's one fairly substantial skill, namely starting the arc blind, one essential skill that you don't need to learn. And that's because you can see your work ahead of time. Now, all of these auto darkening helmets have controls on the inside to allow you to adjust the amount of darkening. They allow you to adjust how fast the darkening kicks in. They're really great. I have known professional welders who have poo-pooed this, especially when they first came out. Oh, that's just for beginners. Or real welders don't need auto darkening helmets. But you know, you put an auto darkening helmet even on an experienced welder, and they say, hey, boy, I really like this. This really works. And that's why 95% of all welding helmets nowadays are the auto darkening style. A helmet like this used to cost $500 or more. Now you can get a decent one for around $100 or less. So really quite an advancement. So far we've talked about the shock hazard, the burn hazard, the vision hazard, and now the fume hazard. So whenever you weld anything, because of the high temperatures involved, fumes are going to be released into the air. So are they dangerous? What do you need to do about that? Well, welding should always happen in a well-ventilated environment. So if you can move outside to do your welding, well, that's great. That's as much ventilation as is humanly possible to get, is to actually go outside. And I weld outside whenever I can. Here in my shop, I have a garage door. Everything's on wheels. I can wheel it outside. Really like to weld outdoors. But I can't always weld outdoors, so I have an exhaust fan here in my shop. It moves about 250 cubic feet of air per minute, which is roughly 3 times the volume of a bathroom fan. So it really does keep the air clean. And those two things, either welding outside or welding in a mechanically ventilated interior space, that's great. Now there is one special issue I need to mention, and that's the welding of galvanized metal. So my course, the MIG welding course, is all about learning to weld mild steel, which is the most common kind of steel around. Most of the welding that most people want to do is mild steel. Sometimes, in order to protect that mild steel from rusting, it undergoes a process called galvanizing, which takes that metal, cleans it, immerses it in molten zinc, and the zinc bonds to the surface, kind of like soldering almost. It's like you're coating the whole thing in solder, except it's zinc, and zinc is highly corrosion resistant. You can weld galvanized metal. You're best off to to grind off the galvanizing in the area you want to weld. But even when you do that, there's still going to be enough heat generated that it's going to vaporize some of that zinc. That gives off, well, fairly billowy clouds of white smoke. And that zinc smoke can cause a condition called welder's flu. Essentially, it's a kind of low-grade poisoning, in a sense, and you feel kind of listless, like you have the flu. It's easy to avoid that, though, and it just means you have to take extra precautions for welding in a well-ventilated place. Also, if you grind the galvanizing off in the area you're going to be welding, it's greatly going to reduce the amount of smoke given off, and you're going to get a better weld, too, because zinc doesn't actually weld very well. It kind of gets in the way of a proper weld. So as useful as it is for corrosion resistance, it can cause this white smoke that can make you feel sick. The conditions aren't long-term, but you better safe than sorry, essentially. So lots of ventilation all the time, but an exceptionally large amount if you're welding anything with a zinc coating. So the final hazard, the burning down your shop hazard, burning down your house hazard, that would be caused by sparks. Sparks are going to fly, so you want to make sure that there's nothing flammable around where those sparks are likely to land. You're going to want to give yourself kind of a cushion. So, don't just move as far away as you need from that pile of wood or whatever. Move twice as far as you need. Don't weld anywhere near gas cans or propane tanks or anything like that. It's really pretty obvious. And as an added precaution, just in case something does catch fire, you want a plan B. You want a second layer of protection. So keep a fire extinguisher handy. That's easy enough. I have never had to use a fire extinguisher to put out a fire caused by welding. Every once in a while, like the last time, I was rubbing down some surfaces to remove grease and oil after I had cleaned them. And there was a little bit of alcohol left on a paper shop towel. It was on the ground. A spark landed on it, caught fire, stepped on it, put it out. I mean, there's no big deal. If you keep the combustibles far back from the area, then you'll be fine. So essentially, bottom line is, despite appearances, despite the fact that all kinds of arc welding looks impressive and dangerous and, all that stuff, the safety precautions you need to take to be perfectly safe, they're really very simple and quite straightforward.